What if a heart, frozen by loss and buried in the solitude of a vast frontier, could be thawed by the faintest whisper of life in a snow-swept wilderness? What if a single act of kindness could rewrite a destiny that had been cruelly scrawled on a scrap of paper? This is the story of such a kindness, a love born in the heart of a blizzard, and a cowboy who saw a future where everyone else saw only the end of the trail. The wind was a living thing, a predator that howled across the endless white plains of the Montana Territory, clawing at the small, isolated cabin with icy talons. Inside, Silas stirred the embers in his stone hearth, the low fire casting long, dancing shadows across the rough-hewn walls. He was a man carved from the same unforgiving landscape, his face a road map of sun and sorrow, his eyes the color of a winter sky just before a storm. Solitude had been his only companion for 5 years, a silent partner in the lonely work of running a ranch that was more memory than enterprise. It was the ghost of a laugh, the echo of a small hand in his, that kept him tethered to this place. He pulled on his heavy sheepskin coat, the familiar weight a hollow comfort. The cattle needed checking. Some of the new calves were weak, and a night like this could steal them away before the dawn. He stepped outside, the cold hitting him like a physical blow, stealing the air from his lungs. Snow swirled in a blinding frenzy, reducing the world to shades of grey and white. As he trudged toward the linter that sheltered his small herd, a shape caught his eye. A dark lump against the stark, unforgiving canvas of the snowdrift, half buried and unnervingly still. A stray calf, he thought, his heart sinking. Or maybe a wolf, caught in the open. He changed course, his boots sinking deep with each step, the wind tearing at him, trying to push him back. As he drew closer, the shape resolved itself, and the breath he was holding escaped in a ragged cloud. It was not an animal. It was a person, a small figure curled into a tight ball, wearing clothes so thin they were practically an invitation to the grave. He ran the last few feet, his own cold forgotten, a primal urgency taking over. He knelt, turning the figure over gently. It was a woman. Her face was alabaster pale, tinged with a deathly blue at the lips. Her lashes were feathered with ice, her hair a tangle of dark strands against the snow. For a moment, he thought he was too late, that the wilderness had already claimed another soul. But then, a faint, shallow puff of air escaped her lips. She was alive. Barely. Pinned to the collar of her threadbare coat was a piece of folded, water-stained paper. His fingers, clumsy with cold and haste, fumbled with it. He unfolded it. 2 words were scrawled in angry, jagged letters. Orphan Trash. A wave of cold that had nothing to do with the weather washed over him. It was a coldness of human cruelty, a viciousness that could leave someone to die with a curse as their only eulogy. He looked from the cruel note to the fragile face of the woman in his arms, and something inside his frozen heart cracked. He had been a fortress of grief for 5 years, a man living alongside his ghosts. But in that moment, the fortress was breached. Without a second thought, he ripped the note from her coat, crushing it in his fist. He gathered her into his arms. She weighed almost nothing, a bundle of cold limbs and fading life. "Not on my land," he growled to the howling wind, his voice a raw promise. "Not while I'm here." He turned his back on the storm and carried her toward the distant, wavering light of his cabin, a sanctuary he hadn't realized he was guarding until now. Clara drifted back to consciousness slowly, like a swimmer rising from an impossibly deep and frigid lake. The first thing she registered was warmth, a heavy, profound heat that seemed to be sinking into her very bones. It was a feeling so alien, so long absent, that for a moment she believed she must have died and this was some strange, gentle afterlife. She smelled wood smoke and brewing coffee, sense of life and home that made her throat ache with a sudden, sharp grief. Her eyelids felt weighted down, but she forced them open. The light was dim, golden. She was lying on a narrow cot, buried under a mountain of thick wool blankets and a heavy buffalo hide. A fire crackled and spat in a large stone hearth across the room, its light illuminating the simple, masculine space, a sturdy wooden table, 2 chairs, shelves lined with tins and a few worn books. A man sat at the table, his back to her, his shoulders broad under a flannel shirt. He was cleaning a rifle, his movements economical and sure. Fear, cold and sharp, pierced through the warm fog in her mind. Where was she? Who was this man? The last thing she remembered was the biting wind, the endless snow, and the face of the man she was meant to marry, twisted in a sneer as he shoved her from his wagon. Corbin Blackwood. His final words echoed in her memory, as sharp as the note he'd pinned to her coat. "I've no use for damaged goods." Panic seized her, and she tried to sit up, a strangled gasp escaping her lips. The movement sent a wave of dizziness through her, and the blankets felt impossibly heavy. The man at the table froze. He set the rifle down with deliberate care and turned. He was not Corbin. This man's face was harder, weathered by sun and wind, but his eyes held no cruelty. They were guarded, tired, but they watched her with a quiet intensity that was not threatening. He stood and walked toward the cot, his step slow, as if approaching a spooked foal. He stopped a few feet away, holding a tin cup. "Easy now," he said, his voice a low rumble, like stones shifting at the bottom of a river. "You've had a rough go of it. Just lie still." He held out the cup. "It's just broth. You need to get your strength back." Clara stared at him, her mind racing. He was a stranger. A man. And men were the architects of her misery. Her father had sold her to settle a debt. Corbin had discarded her like refuse. Why would this one be any different? "Who are you?" she whispered, her voice a dry, rasping thing. "Where am I?" "Name's Silas," he answered, his gaze unwavering. "This is my ranch. I found you in the snow. You were near frozen." He gestured with the cup again. "Drink this. It'll help." She hesitated, suspicion warring with the desperate gnawing in her stomach. But she was too weak to fight, too tired to run. Slowly, she pushed herself up on one elbow, the blankets pooling around her waist. She took the cup with a trembling hand, the warmth of the tin a small miracle against her cold skin. She drank, the hot, salty broth a shock of life to her system. He watched her, his expression unreadable. When she finished, he took the empty cup. "There's more when you're ready," he said, turning back toward the hearth. "My name is Clara," she said to his back, the words feeling strange in her mouth. It felt important that he know her name, that she was not just a shape in the snow, not just the words on that hateful note. He paused, his hand on the handle of the coffee pot. He nodded slowly. "Clara," he repeated, testing the name. He didn't turn around, but she saw his shoulders relax, just a fraction. "Get some rest, Clara. You're safe here." Safe. The word was a foreign country she had never been allowed to visit. Lying back against the pillow, the warmth of the fire on her face and the taste of the broth still on her tongue, she allowed herself, for the first time in a very long time, to believe it might be true. As sleep reclaimed her, she didn't dream of the snow or of Corbin's cruel face. She dreamt of the steady, quiet presence of the man named Silas, a lone figure standing guard against the storm. Days bled into a week. The blizzard raged outside, locking the small cabin in a world of white. For Clara, it was a time of slow healing. Silas was a man of few words, his presence a steady, quiet rhythm in the small space. He moved with a purpose that spoke of long familiarity with his tasks and his solitude. He tended to her with a gruff, almost awkward gentleness, changing the dressings on her frostbitten fingers, ensuring the fire never died, and making her eat the bland but nourishing stews he cooked. He never asked about her past, never mentioned the note he must have found. He simply gave her space, silence, and the unspoken promise of sanctuary. Slowly, Clara began to mend, not just in body, but in spirit. The terror that had been her constant companion began to recede, replaced by a tentative curiosity. She watched Silas as he worked, mending a leather harness by the firelight, his large, calloused hands surprisingly deft. She saw the way he would pause and stare into the flames, his expression distant, his eyes filled with a deep, ancient sadness. She recognized it, for it was a mirror of her own. She began to help in small ways, at first just folding the blankets on her cot, then graduating to peeling potatoes for their supper. Each small act was a reclamation of herself. One afternoon, as she was sweeping the hearth, he spoke without looking up from the bridle he was oiling. "You don't have to do that, I want to," she replied, her voice soft but firm. "I can't just be a burden." He finally looked at her, his gaze direct. "You're not a burden." The words were simple, stated as plain fact, but they landed in her chest with the weight of a benediction. No one had ever told her she wasn't a burden. She had been born one to her father, a debt to be paid. She was a useless burden to Corbin. But to this quiet, sad-eyed man, she was not. A fragile trust began to grow between them, nurtured in the shared silence and the small, domestic rituals of their snowbound life. The storm finally broke, and the world outside was revealed in a breathtaking spectacle of sun on pristine snow. The light flooded the cabin, making the dust motes dance in the air. That same day, another presence arrived. An old man on a sturdy pony, his face so wrinkled it looked like a dried apple, rode up to the cabin. This was Gus, Silas's only ranch hand, who lived in a small bunkhouse a quarter-mile away and had been snowed in. He stomped into the cabin, shaking snow from his hat, and stopped dead when he saw Clara. His eyes, sharp and intelligent, darted from her to Silas and back again. "Well, I'll be," he muttered, pulling at his white whiskers. "Thought you'd finally taken to talking to the furniture, Silas. Didn't figure you'd gone and found yourself some company." Silas made the introductions, his tone flat. "This is Clara. She was caught in the storm. She'll be staying for a while." Gus nodded slowly, his gaze assessing Clara with an unnerving scrutiny. "Caught in the storm, you say?" He looked pointedly at her thin dress and worn shoes, which sat by the hearth. "A long way from anywhere to be caught in a storm." He turned to Silas when Clara had moved to the other side of the cabin, his voice lowered to a conspiratorial grumble. "You know who she is, don't you? Heard talk in town before the snows hit. Corbin Blackwood was expectin' some mail-order bride to settle a debt. A little thing, they said. She never showed. Folks figured she had the good sense to turn tail and run." Silas's jaw tightened. "Her name is Clara. I ain't questionin' her name, son," Gus said, his voice softening. "I'm questionin' the trouble that's hitched to it. Blackwood ain't the kind of man to let something he considers is just wander off. He's proud. And mean. You taking her in, that's like poking a rattlesnake with a short stick. She had nowhere to go," Silas said, his voice low and final, a clear end to the discussion. Gus sighed, a long, weary sound. He looked at Silas, his old eyes filled with a deep affection and a profound worry. "I know that heart of yours, boy. It's too big for your own good. Always picking up strays." He glanced over at Clara, who was watching the fire, her profile delicate and sad. "Just be careful this stray don't get you bit." Gus's words hung in the air long after he'd left, a stark reminder that the sanctuary of the cabin was temporary, and that the world outside, with all its dangers, was waiting. That evening, as Silas stared into the fire, Clara came and sat in the other chair. The silence stretched between them, no longer awkward, but filled with unspoken things. "He left me," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "The man I was supposed to marry. Mr. Blackwood. He said I was." Insufficient. Silas didn't look at her, but his hands, resting on his knees, curled into tight fists. "He's a fool." Then the simple, fierce loyalty in his voice was more comforting than any flowery reassurance. It was a shield, offered freely. "Gus is right," she continued, her gaze fixed on the flames. "He will come looking. Not for me, but for his pride. I've brought trouble to your door, Silas." He finally turned to face her, and in his eyes, she saw not pity, but a resolute strength that calmed the frantic beating of her own heart. "This door has seen trouble before," he said quietly. "It's still standing. And so are we." In that moment, Clara knew she was no longer just a survivor. She was part of a we. And that felt more like home than anywhere she had ever been. The arrival of Corbin Blackwood was not a surprise, but it was a violation nonetheless. He came on a jet-black stallion, a horse as arrogant and cruel as its master, flanked by two hired men whose eyes were as cold and empty as their gun belts. They rode into Silas's yard as if they owned it, the horses churning the melting snow into brown slush. Silas was splitting firewood, the rhythmic thud of his axe the only sound in the crisp morning air. He saw them coming and slowly, deliberately, set his axe into the chopping block. He didn't reach for the pistol on his hip. He simply stood and waited, a calm, immovable object in the path of a storm. Clara, who had been hanging laundry on a line near the cabin, saw them too. Her blood ran cold. The sight of Corbin, his handsome face marred by a permanent sneer, brought back the terror of the trail, the feeling of being worthless, discarded. She froze, her hands clutching a damp sheet, her knuckles white. Corbin swung down from his horse, his expensive leather coat a stark contrast to Silas's worn work clothes. He ignored Silas at first, his eyes locking on Clara. A slow, predatory smile spread across his lips. Well, he drawled, his voice carrying an oily charm. "Look what the thaw washed up. I was wondering where my property had gotten to." He took a step toward her. Instinctively, Silas moved, placing himself squarely between them. His movement was fluid and silent, the motion of a man who knew how to handle threats. "She's not your property," Silas said, his voice quiet but carrying the unmistakable weight of command. Corbin's smile faltered, replaced by a flash of irritation. He finally deigned to look at Silas, his gaze sweeping over him with open contempt. "Stay out of this, rancher. This is a business matter. This." thing, he gestured dismissively at Clara, was sent to me to clear a family debt. She belongs to me until that debt is paid. She belongs to herself, Silas countered, his eyes like chips of flint. And she's under my protection. You'll leave her be. Corbin laughed, a harsh, ugly sound that echoed in the quiet yard. Protection. You can't even protect this pathetic patch of dirt you call a ranch. I own the bank in Redemption. I own the sheriff. I own this entire valley. And you think you can protect her from me? He stepped closer, trying to intimidate Silas with his proximity, his men shifting behind him, their hands hovering near their guns. You've always had a soft spot for broken things, haven't you, Silas? I remember your wife. Frail little thing, wasn't she? Didn't last long out here. A muscle jumped in Silas's jaw. The air crackled with a sudden, violent tension. The mention of his wife was a line crossed, a sacred ground desecrated. He didn't flinch, didn't rise to the bait, but a new coldness entered his eyes, a dangerous stillness that was more menacing than any outburst. Clara, watching from behind Silas, felt a surge of something she hadn't felt before, not fear, but rage. The insult to the memory of Silas's wife was an attack on the one person who had shown her kindness. She found her voice, shaky but clear. The debt was a lie. My father was tricked. I owe you nothing. Corbin's head snapped toward her, his mask of civility dropping completely. You'll learn to hold your tongue, girl, he snarled. When I get you back to my ranch, you'll learn all about what you owe me. That's not going to happen, Silas said, his voice dropping to a near whisper. You need to get on your horse and ride out of here. Now, for a long moment, the two men stood locked in a battle of wills. Corbin's arrogance against Silas's unyielding resolve. The air was thick with the threat of violence. Corbin's men looked to their boss, waiting for the signal. Corbin looked at Silas's steady gaze, at the solid set of his shoulders, and for the first time, a flicker of uncertainty crossed his face. He was used to men who could be bought or bullied. Silas was neither. With a final, venomous glare, Corbin spun on his heel. This isn't over, he spat, swinging himself back onto his horse. I'll ruin you, Silas. I'll take this ranch out from under you piece by piece. I'll bleed you dry. And when you have nothing left, I'll be back for her. He wheeled his horse around, kicking up a spray of mud and snow that spattered the clean laundry Clara had just hung. Then he and his men galloped away, leaving a ringing silence in their wake. Clara finally let out the breath she'd been holding, her body trembling. Silas turned to her, his face grim, the cold fury still lingering in his eyes. She looked at him, her heart aching for him, for the pain Corbin's cruel words had inflicted. I am so sorry, Silas, she whispered, tears welling in her eyes. Gus was right. I've brought this down on you. He reached out, not to touch her, but his hand hovered in the air between them, a gesture of reassurance. This isn't your fault, Clara, he said, his voice rough with emotion. This is his. And is right about one thing. She looked at him, confused. It's not over, he said, his gaze turning toward the trail where Corbin had disappeared. But we'll face it. Together, the word together was a promise, a declaration of alliance. The line had been drawn not in the mud of the yard, but in the steadfast resolve of a lonely cowboy who had finally found something worth fighting for again. Corbin Blackwood was a man who preferred to let poison do its work slowly. He began to squeeze Silas, just as he had promised. The first sign of trouble came when Silas rode into Redemption for supplies. Jed, the owner of the general store, a man Silas had known for years, couldn't meet his eye. Sorry, Silas, Jed mumbled, polishing an already clean counter. Can't extend you any more credit. Bank called in my loan. Blackwood's orders. It was the same story at the feed store and the blacksmith's. The invisible walls of Corbin's influence were closing in, turning the town that had once been a community into a hostile territory. Silas returned to the ranch with his wagon far emptier than it should have been, his face set in grim lines. He didn't have to explain. Clara saw it in the scarcity of flour and coffee, in the hard set of his jaw. The guilt she felt was a physical weight, a constant ache in her chest. She worked tirelessly, determined to lessen the burden she felt she had become. She learned to mend fences with wire and grit, her small hands growing calloused. She learned to cook with meager rations, turning potatoes and the occasional rabbit into savory stews. She brought life back into the small cabin, scrubbing the floors until the wood gleamed, patching Silas's shirts, and even finding a patch of earth near the house where the sun hit just right, promising a spring garden. The hardship, instead of driving them apart, wove their lives together more tightly. They became a team, their days falling into a rhythm of shared labor and quiet companionship. The long evenings were filled not with despair, but with a growing intimacy. They would sit by the fire, the silence between them comfortable, companionable. He would watch her as she read from one of his few books, her brow furrowed in concentration, the firelight catching the warm tones in her dark hair. She would watch him as he sharpened his tools, his movements filled with a quiet competence that she found deeply reassuring. One night, he spoke of his past, the words coming slowly, painfully, as if he were pulling them from a deep well of sorrow. He told her about Sarah, his wife, a schoolteacher from the East who had fallen in love with him and his dream of building a life on the frontier. He spoke of their son, Daniel, a boy with his mother's smile and a boundless energy. The fever came in the winter, Silas said, his voice thick, his eyes fixed on a point far beyond the cabin walls. Took them both inside of a week. I buried them myself, up on that ridge, he pointed toward the window. After that, this place was just a shell. I was just a ghost, tending to other ghosts. Clara felt her own tears fall, not for herself, but for him, for the devastating loss that had hollowed him out. She reached across the space between them and laid her hand on his arm. It was the first time she had initiated contact. His muscles tensed under her touch, but he didn't pull away. "You're not a ghost, Silas," she said softly. "You're the kindest man I have ever known." He looked down at her hand on his arm, then up into her eyes. In their depths, he saw not pity, but an understanding, a shared knowledge of pain. And for the first time in 5 years, he felt something other than grief. A flicker of warmth. A spark of hope. The tension between them shifted, the quiet companionship deepening into something more charged, more fragile. A few nights later, a new threat emerged. They were woken by the frantic lowing of the cattle. Silas grabbed his rifle and was out the door in an instant, Clara close behind him with a lantern. In the moonlight, they could see 2 riders trying to drive the small herd out of the pasture, their figures silhouetted against the horizon. "It's Corbin's men," Silas gritted out, raising his rifle. He fired a warning shot into the air. The sound cracked through the night, and the riders, startled, abandoned their task and galloped off into the darkness. They had saved the cattle, but the message was clear. Corbin was escalating. He was no longer content to starve them out. He was now willing to resort to open theft and violence. They stood in the cold moonlight, the cattle settling around them, their breath pluming in the air. The danger felt close, suffocating. Clara looked at Silas, his profile hard and resolute in the pale light. The fear she felt was overshadowed by a fierce, protective instinct. This man, this ranch, this life they were forging in defiance of the world, it was hers now, too. "What are we going to do?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. He turned to her, and the look in his eyes was one of utter determination. "We fight back," he said. He reached out and took the lantern from her, his fingers brushing against hers. The brief touch sent a jolt through her, a current of warmth against the cold night. In that shared moment of danger and defiance, they both knew that this was no longer just a matter of survival. It was a fight for a future they were only just beginning to imagine, a future they desperately wanted to build together. The failed cattle raid marked a turning point. The quiet siege had become an open war, and Silas knew they were outmatched. Corbin had money, men, and the law in his pocket. A direct confrontation would be suicide. Their only weapon was the truth. "The debt," Silas said one morning, pacing the floor of the cabin while Clara watched him from the table. "You said it was a lie. How do you know?" "My father," Clara explained, her voice low. "He was a good man, but not a smart one when it came to business. He wanted to buy more land, and Blackwood offered him a loan. There were papers, but my father, he could barely read. He signed them. A month later, Blackwood claimed the first payment was late and the penalties had tripled the debt, an amount we could never repay. He offered to forgive it. In exchange for me," her voice broke on the last words. Silas stopped pacing and looked at her, his expression a mixture of fury and compassion. "He's a predator, preying on the desperate. If he did it to your father, he's done it to others. A man that crooked, that greedy. He has to keep records. A ledger. Something to keep track of all his schemes. It would be in his office at the bank in Redemption," Clara said, her eyes widening as she understood where he was going. "But it's impossible. He keeps it locked up tighter than a drum." Gus arrived later that day, his face grim. He'd been in town, listening. "It's worse than we thought," the old man said, accepting a cup of coffee. Blackwood's put a lien on this ranch. He's claiming you defaulted on a loan for last year's seed. He forged the paperwork, Silas. The judge, bought and paid for, is set to sign it over to him at the end of the week. The news was a body blow. They were running out of time. Corbin wasn't just going to ruin them. He was going to steal the very land Silas's family had worked for generations, the land where his wife and son were buried. The desperate plan began to take shape. He's arrogant, Silas reasoned, his voice tense. He's hosting a big poker game for some cattle barons from out of state. It's Friday night. At the saloon. He'll want to show off, impress them. He'll be distracted and his office will be empty, Clara finished, her heart pounding. I can get in. Silas and Gus both turned to look at her. No, Silas said immediately, his voice sharp. Absolutely not. It's too dangerous, you can't go, she argued, standing to face him. You're too well known. They'd spot you in a second. And Gus is. Well, Gus is Gus, she said, giving the old man an affectionate smile. But me. No one in that town pays me any mind. I'm just the Orphan Trash. I can slip in and out without anyone noticing. I'm small. I can get through the back window. She's got a point, son, Gus admitted reluctantly. She's less of a risk than either of us. Silas stared at her, his face a mask of conflict. The thought of putting her in that kind of danger was abhorrent to him. He had sworn to protect her, not to send her into the lion's den. But as he looked into her eyes, he saw not the frightened girl he had pulled from the snow, but a woman of incredible courage and resolve. Her chin was set, her gaze steady. She was no longer a victim waiting to be rescued. She was his partner. We'll need a diversion, he said, finally conceding. His mind was already working, calculating the risks, formulating a strategy. Something big enough to pull Corbin and the sheriff out of the saloon, give you a clear window of time. Gus's eyes lit up with a mischievous glint. I might have an idea about that. Involves a few sticks of dynamite and Old Man Hemlock's abandoned mine shaft up on the ridge. Ought to make a boom big enough to sound like the end of the world. The plan was reckless, a long shot. Everything had to go perfectly. If Clara was caught, Corbin would not be merciful. If the diversion failed, Silas and Gus would be facing a hangman's noose. They spent the next 2 days preparing. Gus gathered the dynamite. Silas studied a hand-drawn map of the town, memorizing the layout of the alley behind the bank. He and Clara practiced. He showed her how to jimmy a window latch with a thin knife, how to move silently, how to stay in the shadows. With each lesson, the tension between them grew, a humming wire of shared purpose and unspoken fear. The night before the plan was to be set in motion, he found her standing outside the cabin, looking up at the stars. The air was cold and clear. Are you sure about this? He asked, his voice low. She turned to him, her face pale in the moonlight. I've been running or hiding my whole life, Silas. I'm tired of being afraid. That man took my home, my family's name. I won't let him take yours, too. This is the first time I've ever had a chance to fight back. I have to take it. He stepped closer, the space between them shrinking until he could feel the warmth radiating from her. He could smell the clean scent of soap and the faint aroma of wood smoke that clung to her clothes. He reached out and gently tucked a stray strand of hair behind her ear. His fingers lingered for a moment on the soft skin of her cheek. Be careful, he whispered, his voice thick with an emotion he could no longer name. I can't lose you, Clara. She leaned into his touch, her eyes closing for a moment. You won't, she promised. In the quiet darkness, under the watchful eyes of a million stars, they stood on the precipice of a dangerous gamble, bound not just by a shared enemy, but by a love that had taken root in the harshest of winters and was now ready to fight for the promise of spring. The town of Redemption was alive with a nervous energy on Friday night. Light and raucous noise spilled from the saloon, where Corbin Blackwood held court. Silas and Clara, hidden in the shadows of the livery stable across the street, watched the entrance. They saw the sheriff go in, along with the other powerful men Corbin was so desperate to impress. It was time. Silas turned to Clara, his hands gripping her shoulders. His face was grim in the dim light. Remember the plan. Gus will set the charge in 10 minutes. The explosion will be the signal. You go in, find the ledger, and get out. I'll be waiting in the alley. If you're not out in 5 minutes, I'm coming in after you. I'll be out, she said, her voice steady despite the frantic beating of her heart. She gave him a small, brave smile. Don't worry, he looked at her, his heart aching with the terrible risk they were taking. He wanted to tell her everything he was feeling, that in a few short weeks she had become the center of his world, that the thought of a future without her was as bleak as the winter landscape he had wandered for so long. But there was no time. Instead, he leaned down and pressed a firm, chaste kiss to her forehead. "Stay safe," he breathed against her skin. Then he was gone, melting back into the deeper shadows to take up his position. Clara took a deep, steadying breath and began to move. She scurried along the backs of buildings, a small, ghost-like figure in the dark. She reached the alley behind the bank, her heart pounding against her ribs. The alley was narrow and filled with the stench of garbage and stale beer. At the far end, she could see the faint silhouette of Silas, waiting. She pressed herself against the cold brick wall beneath the office window, her knife in her hand, and waited. The minutes stretched into an eternity. Then, a deafening boom echoed from the hills north of town, a deep, earth-shaking roar that rattled the windows in their frames. Shouts erupted from the saloon. Doors flew open, and men poured into the street, pointing and yelling toward the orange glow that now lit up the northern ridge. As planned, the sheriff and Corbin were the first to mount up, their faces etched with alarm as they galloped out of town toward the mine collapse. This was a chance. With trembling fingers, Clara slid the blade of the knife into the window frame. It took a few agonizing seconds, her breath held tight in her chest, but then she heard a soft click. The latch was open. She pushed the window up, hoisted herself over the sill, and dropped silently into the darkness of Corbin's office. The room smelled of cigar smoke and leather. Moonlight streamed through the window, illuminating a large, imposing oak desk. She moved quickly, her eyes scanning the room. She checked the desk drawers first, her hands searching through papers, her mind racing. It wasn't there. She moved to the large bookshelf, running her hands along the spines of the books, searching for a hidden safe. Nothing. Panic began to bubble in her throat. Where would he keep it? She forced herself to be calm, to think like Corbin. He was arrogant. He would want his secrets close, where he could admire his own cleverness. Her eyes fell on a framed map of the valley hanging on the wall. It seemed too ornate, too prominent. She ran her fingers along the heavy wooden frame. Near the bottom, her fingers found a small, almost invisible button. She pressed it. With a soft click, the map swung outward, revealing a hidden wall safe. Her heart leaped. But it was locked, a combination dial gleaming in the moonlight. Despair washed over her. She would never guess the combination. Then her eyes fell on the silver trophy on Corbin's desk, an award for a prize-winning bull from the state fair. The year was engraved on a small plaque, 1884. It was a long shot. Her fingers, slick with sweat, turned the dial. Right to 18. Left to 84. She pulled the handle. It didn't budge. She tried again, her mind racing. What else was important to him? The date the town was founded? His birthday? Then she remembered something Gus had said. Corbin had bought the bank on a specific date, a day he bragged about constantly, the day he claimed his empire truly began. August 10th, 8 to 10. She spun the dial again. Right to 8. Left to 10. She held her breath and pulled the handle. The heavy steel door swung open. And there it was. A thick, leather-bound ledger. She grabbed it, her hand shaking with relief. Just as she turned to leave, she heard the sound of footsteps in the hallway outside the office. The doorknob began to turn. Terror, cold and absolute, seized her. She was trapped. The office door creaked open, and Corbin Blackwood stepped inside, his face a thunderous mask of fury. Behind him stood one of his men, the one who had stayed behind. "I knew it," Corbin snarled, his eyes locking onto Clara, who stood frozen by the open safe, the ledger clutched to her chest. "I knew that explosion was too convenient." A little stray, trying to be a thief, he advanced on her, his predatory smile returning. "Did you really think it would be that easy? Did you think you could steal from me and get away with it?" Clara backed away, her mind screaming. The alley. Silas. He would be coming. She had to buy him time. "It's over, Corbin," she said, her voice surprisingly steady. "This ledger proves everything. The fraudulent loans, the stolen land. Everyone will know what you are," he laughed, a chilling, humorless sound. "This town is mine. That ledger is my word against yours. And who do you think they'll believe? Me, or some orphan trash he picked up in a snowdrift?" He lunged, grabbing her arm in a brutal grip. The ledger fell to the floor with a heavy thud. He twisted her arm behind her back, his face close to hers, his breath foul with whiskey. "You are going to learn a very painful lesson about loyalty," he hissed. "And your precious cowboy is going to watch," but just as his grip tightened, the window behind him shattered inward. Silas exploded into the room, a silent, furious force of nature. He had heard the voices, seen the light from the lamp Corbin's man had lit. He hadn't waited. He moved with a speed and ferocity that took both men by surprise. He hit the hired man with a single, disabling blow that sent him crashing into the bookshelf. Then he turned on Corbin. It was not a barroom brawl. It was a cold, calculated dismantling. Silas didn't fight with the wild rage of a cornered animal. He fought with the focused, righteous fury of a man protecting his entire world. Every punch was precise, every movement economical. He was driven by the memory of a grave on a lonely ridge, by the sight of Clara near dead in the snow, and by the fierce, burning love he felt for the woman Corbin was trying to destroy. Corbin, though larger, was no match for him. He was a bully, accustomed to his victims cowering. He swung wildly, his punches fueled by arrogance and whiskey. Silas ducked and weaved, his fists finding their mark with punishing accuracy. He drove Corbin back across the room, the impacts of his blows echoing like hammer strikes. Finally, with a powerful right cross, Silas sent Corbin crashing into his own oversized desk, which splintered under the impact. Corbin lay there, dazed and bleeding, the fight knocked out of him. Sirens and shouts filled the street outside. The diversion had worked perfectly, but the sound of the fight had drawn the townsfolk who had remained behind. The door burst open again, this time revealing the town's blacksmith, the store owner Jed, and a dozen other men, their faces a mixture of fear and curiosity. They stopped short, taking in the scene, the shattered window, the groaning henchman, Corbin Blackwood bleeding on his broken desk, and Silas standing over him, his chest heaving, his knuckles raw. Clara, who had scooped up the ledger during the fight, stepped forward into the lamplight. "He's a thief and a liar," she declared, her voice ringing with a strength she never knew she possessed. She held up the ledger. "This is the proof. He cheated my father. He forged the lien on Silas's ranch. Look for yourselves. See how many of your own names are in here, with debts you never knew you had." Jed, the store owner, stepped forward cautiously and took the book. He flipped through the pages, his eyes widening in shock and then narrowing in anger. "She's right," he said, his voice shaking with rage. "He's got a forged deed to my store in here." He looked up, first at the other townsman, then at the defeated figure of Corbin Blackwood. The spell of fear that Corbin had cast over redemption was broken. The men surged forward, their voices rising in an angry chorus. They surrounded Corbin, their faces hard with the fury of betrayed trust. Silas ignored them. He went straight to Clara, his eyes searching her face, checking for any injury. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice rough. She nodded, tears of relief streaming down her face. "I'm all right." He pulled her into his arms, holding her tight against him, burying his face in her hair. He held her as if he would never let her go, the protector who had found his purpose, the savior who had, in turn, been saved. The ordeal was over. Their fight was won. The aftermath in redemption was swift. With the ledger as undeniable proof, Corbin Blackwood's empire of fear and deceit crumbled overnight. The cattle barons he had been so eager to impress rode out of town before dawn, wanting no part of his disgrace. The sheriff, implicated by notes in the ledger, was stripped of his badge and run out of town on a rail. Corbin himself was locked in his own jail cell, awaiting the arrival of a federal marshal. The town, free from his oppressive shadow, began to breathe again. Silas and Clara became unlikely heroes. The same people who had shunned Silas now clapped him on the back, offering him free supplies and heartfelt apologies. They treated Clara with a newfound respect, their eyes filled with admiration for her courage. But the praise and attention made them both uncomfortable. Their victory had been a private war for a personal peace. As soon as they could, they retreated to the quiet sanctuary of the ranch. Spring had finally arrived in earnest. The last of the snow had melted, revealing the rich, dark earth beneath. The hills were turning a vibrant green, and the creek that ran through their property gurgled with life. The world felt new, washed clean, full of promise. They worked side by side, repairing the damage from the hard winter and the harder fight. They rebuilt the fence the rustlers had broken. They tilled the small plot of land for Clara's garden. They worked in a comfortable, easy silence, their shared experience a bond far stronger than words. The fortress around Silas's heart had completely dissolved. He found himself smiling, a real, genuine smile that reached his eyes. He laughed when one of Clara's seeds was stolen by a cheeky bird. He felt a lightness in his soul that he had thought was lost to him forever. One evening, as the sun set, casting a golden glow over the valley, he and Clara walked up to the ridge where Sarah and Daniel were buried. The two simple wooden crosses stood under the shade of a large oak tree. Clara placed a small bundle of wildflowers she had picked by the creek at the base of the graves. Silas stood beside her, his hat in his hands. "I thought I would be alone forever," he said, his voice quiet. "I thought this was all I had left, memories and this land. But you brought it all back to life, Clara. You brought me back to life." He turned to face her, taking her hands in his. His hands were large and calloused, but his touch was incredibly gentle. "I love you," he said, the word simple, direct, and filled with a profound truth. "I think I started loving you the moment I saw you in the snow." A fighter who just wouldn't give up. Tears welled in Clara's eyes, but they were tears of joy. "I love you, too, Silas," she whispered. "You didn't just save my life. You gave me 1 inch." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, crumpled piece of paper. It was the note. Orphan Trash, he had kept it all this time. He held it up between them for a moment, a symbol of the cruelty she had endured, the past that had almost destroyed her. Then, with a deliberate motion, he tore it into tiny pieces. He opened his hand, and the gentle evening breeze caught the scraps of paper, scattering them into the wind until they were gone. "That was never you," he said softly. "This is you." He gestured to the sprawling ranch around them, the setting sun, the promise of a new day. "Our home. Our future." He squeezed her hands. "Clara, will you marry me? Will you build this life with me?" She didn't have to think. Her answer was in the radiant smile that lit up her face, in the tears that traced paths of happiness down her cheeks. "Yes," she breathed. "Oh, yes, Silas." He pulled her close and kissed her, a deep, passionate kiss filled with all the pain of their pasts and all the hope of their future. It was a kiss of promises kept and new promises made, under the watchful eyes of the setting sun. They stood on that ridge for a long time, wrapped in each other's arms, looking out at the land that was theirs. They were no longer two lonely, broken souls, but one, forged in the crucible of a frontier winter, their love a testament to the enduring power of kindness and the unyielding strength of the human heart. So I ask you, when the world seems cold and cruel, and you feel discarded and alone, could a single act of compassion be waiting just over the next snowdrift? Could the person you were meant to find be the one who needs you most? Share this story if you believe that even in the harshest wilderness, the strongest thing that can ever grow is love.